It was May 2nd, 1964, just a few months after I'd graduated from high school. I had taken a job at the only movie theater in town, hoping to save up some money before heading off to college and finally escaping our small, overly strict community. Back then, cinemas were nothing like they are today. Heavy censorship dictated what could be shown, and in a place like ours, the same 5 movies played on repeat. It quickly became dull, especially for younger audiences, since most of the films were either religiously influenced sci-fi or bland adventure stories, fitting for a town as conservative and deeply religious as ours. One night, as I was searching for the next reel of film for the midnight screening, something unusual caught my eye. Tucked away beneath a dusty shelf, half buried and forgotten, was an old film reel I had never seen before. Curiosity got the better of me, so I picked it up, wiped off the dust, and examined it closely. A strange mix of excitement and confusion washed over me. It was hard to believe that a horror movie had ever made its way into our theater, let alone remained hidden there for who knows how long. But strangely, that wasn't what unsettled me the most. All I could think about was how thrilled my friends would be to finally watch a real horror film. This felt like an incredible discovery. The following night, I gathered my old school friends, inviting them over after the midnight screening. As soon as they arrived, I could barely contain my excitement. I couldn't wait to show them the mysterious reel I had discovered. Their faces lit up with anticipation as I pulled the film from behind the counter, and I felt the same thrill, eager to finally see what it contained. By 1:15 a.m., we had settled into the empty projection room. Once everything was set, I switched off the lights and we took our seats in the front row. The screen flickered to life and slowly, the title Los Olvidados appeared before us. The movie started off normally, following a group of 6 friends in a religious village much like ours. But as the story unfolded, something felt off. Strange details began to stand out, details that unsettled me. The characters bore an uncanny resemblance to my friends. At first, I brushed it off as a coincidence, but the similarities were too precise to ignore. While their names and faces were different, their mannerisms, speech patterns, and even their clothing felt eerily familiar. For instance, the character Brad was almost a mirror image of my friend Matt. Both had adoptive parents, shared a passion for skating, and had a knack for getting into trouble. The only real difference was that Brad in the movie was an excellent student, while Matt barely cared about school. Then there was Julia, the athlete of the group who strongly resembled Mariana. Both were on the swim team, but Julia was a natural talent, excelling in multiple sports and receiving university offers, something Mariana could only dream of. Zach's character was named Sahed, and just like him, he was a party lover who smoked anything he could get his hands on. However, the major difference was that Sahed was Muslim, while Zach had no ties to religion. And then there was Jeanette, the picture-perfect good girl with loving parents and top grades. On the surface, she was just like Claire, except Claire's grades came from cheating and persuading others to do her work for her. Beyond the characters, there was something eerily familiar about the town and its streets, as if I had walked through them before. Still, I brushed off the feeling, convinced it was just my imagination. It seemed too far-fetched to think there could be any real connection between what we were watching and our actual lives, especially since the story centered around someone I didn't recognize at all, Caroline. Caroline's tale marked our first real taste of horror in the film. To be honest, her story felt more sorrowful than frightening. She was a teenager, much like us, living in a deeply religious town, somewhat isolated from modern life. The plot centered around her family's attempt to escape a haunting past by moving to the city. As the film progressed, the atmosphere grew heavier. You could almost feel the weight of it. I was certain we had made the right choice watching this film, though I never could have predicted just how deeply it would affect us. My friends' laughter and casual remarks gradually faded as we became engrossed in the unfolding darkness, unknowingly stepping into a story that felt like it was always meant to be told. At that moment, the mystery surrounding Caroline began to unfold. It felt as if the film was pulling us deeper into the darkest corners of her story. Her parents had once been accused of practicing witchcraft in their former village, suspected of performing sinister rituals. After spending years in hiding, they believed they had finally found a fresh start in a new town. But secrets never stay buried for long. When the truth surfaced, the town erupted with whispers and fear. Her so-called friends, beginning with Claire, acted as if she never existed, and soon the entire community turned against her. But that was just the beginning. Soon the entire town banded together, determined to hunt them down. Caroline and her family were dragged deep into the forest under the guise of a trial. But what happened there was far from justice. It was pure horror. Instead of any fair hearing, they were condemned in the most gruesome way imaginable, buried alive. This scene was harrowing, marking the midpoint of the film, and from there the story spiraled into a relentless cycle of grisly deaths. One by one, the secondary characters met brutal fates, as if each was being punished for their betrayal of Caroline. The first to fall was Brad. One afternoon, while skateboarding home from school, he struck a rock, sending him crashing to the pavement. The impact was so severe that he died instantly. The scene was disturbingly vivid. His skull cracked open and his brain spilled onto the ground in gruesome detail. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, even in modern horror films. The sheer realism made us all gasp in horror, and a sickening feeling twisted in my stomach. Next was Julia. The scene unfolded at swim practice, where the coach signaled for the team to dive in. She leapt into the water but landed awkwardly, twisting her ankle. Struggling to stay afloat, she flailed desperately, her panic growing as she realized she was sinking. What made it even more horrifying was the way her coach and teammates stood by, watching in eerie silence, completely ignoring her frantic pleas for help. The sheer hopelessness of the moment was suffocating. Her struggle continued until, at last, her lungs filled with water and her body went still. That haunting image is something I will never forget. The cycle of horror pressed on, with each death becoming more agonizing than the last. The relentless bloodshed and torment felt disturbingly real, making it unbearable to watch. Sahed's fate was just as horrifying. The night after Brad's tragic end, he was home alone, carelessly leaving a lit cigarette in the kitchen. A gas leak went unnoticed, and when the spark met the fumes, the house erupted in a violent explosion. The screen showed him engulfed in flames, staggering toward the doorway, his screams echoing through the night. He writhed and convulsed for what felt like an eternity, coughing up blood as the fire consumed him. His agony stretched on for nearly 5 minutes before he finally collapsed, lifeless. Claire was the next to fall victim to Caroline's revenge, and her death shattered every boundary I had. She was ambushed on her way home by a group of shadowy figures, their faces obscured by the darkness. Without mercy, they overpowered her, each knife strike more brutal than the last. The scene showed her suffering in excruciating detail, each moment stretched to unbearable lengths. Once their monstrous act was complete, they discarded her lifeless body deep in the same cursed forest where Caroline had met her fate. It was too much. My stomach churned, and a wave of nausea overtook me. I shot up from my seat, barely holding back the urge to vomit. My friends chuckled, assuming I was playing a prank to scare them. But deep down I knew something about this was terribly, inexplicably wrong. Hi, I'm Daniel Carter, and this incident took place when I was living in a rented house in a quiet town in Nashville, Tennessee, where my wife and I stayed for nearly 5 years. Since we got married at a young age, we opted to rent instead of purchasing a home, as we were still working on stabilizing our finances. The only issue was that when we moved in, the basement was already occupied by another tenant, a man named Brian Foster, who couldn't afford to rent the entire house on his own. Initially, the thought of having a stranger living in the basement wasn't appealing to us, but since we had limited options, we had no choice but to accept it. During the first few weeks, my wife and I made an effort to avoid interacting with Brian altogether, but as weeks turned into months, we eventually found ourselves sharing dinner with him every now and then. I won't lie, it felt awkward at first, but over time it simply became a part of our routine. 4 years passed this way, but eventually Brian's behavior began to take a bizarre turn. While he had always been an odd guy, his actions suddenly became even more unsettling. I started noticing that he would come home at around 3 a.m. every night, something that had never been part of his routine before. We knew it was him because the sound of his footsteps and the strange noises from downstairs would frequently wake us up. One day, I decided to confront him about it. "Hey Brian, why are you coming home so late these days? "We keep hearing strange noises," I asked. His response was casual, almost dismissive. "Oh, my boss switched me to night shifts. It's a real pain. But I'll try to be quieter next time. Didn't mean to disturb you." At the times, we took his word for it and didn't think much of it. We had no reason to suspect anything unusual. For a while, Brian kept his promise, but every now and then, we would still wake up to those eerie sounds. A week later, my wife woke me up early in the morning, looking uneasy. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with our bathtub," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked, still groggy. "I don't know, just go check it out," she replied. "Send the next paragraph when you're ready." I walked into the bathroom and was immediately hit with a foul smell. The bathtub was full of murky, stagnant water, and strange debris was bubbling up from the drain. To make matters worse, the toilets were clogged as well. Concerned, my wife and I decided to check with Brian to see if he was experiencing the same issue in the basement. "Morning, guys," Brian greeted us cheerfully from the sofa, but I noticed right away that he hadn't showered. He had a bit of an unpleasant odor. "Brian, we've got a problem with the bathtub and toilets. They're completely clogged. Any chance you're having the same issue downstairs? Do you think you can help us, or should we just call a plumber?" He immediately looked concerned and said, "No need for that. The pipes in this place act up all the time. I'll take care of it right now." Without hesitation, he rushed to the bathroom, did something out of our view, and soon enough the toilet appeared to be working again. We thanked him and he just gave us a small smile before heading back to his space in the basement. Strangely enough, by the next day, everything seemed completely normal again. Every time we mentioned calling a plumber, Aaron was quick to shut down the idea. "It's nothing unusual, I can handle it," he would insist. But after 3 weeks of the same issue happening over and over, my wife and I decided enough was enough. It was time to bring in a professional. When the plumbers arrived, Aaron was the one who answered the door, and his reaction was unsettling. His face tensed and his usual easygoing demeanor vanished. He looked uneasy, almost irritated, but we brushed it off. The repairs were long overdue, and it was clear he couldn't fix the problem permanently. After a brief hesitation, Aaron finally stepped aside and let the plumbers in. My wife wasted no time leading them to the bathroom to show them the issue. As soon as they were out of sight, Aaron suddenly grabbed my arm, his grip tight and uncharacteristically aggressive. His voice dropped to a low growl. "Why did you call them? I told you I would handle it." I was taken aback. I had never seen Aaron act this way before. "Calm down," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're covering all the costs. There's no need to get worked up." Before Aaron could say anything else, one of the plumbers called out, "Sir, we've checked everything, and the blockage seems to be in the main drain. That should be located in the basement." Aaron's face twisted with anger upon hearing this, and I couldn't understand why he was so upset. But after a tense moment, he finally released my arm and reluctantly told the plumbers to follow him to the basement. In the 4 years we'd lived together, my wife and I had barely ever set foot in Aaron's space, respecting his privacy. But as we stepped inside this time, we were utterly shocked. The room was a disaster. Discarded cigarette butts, empty bottles, and piles of rotten food littered every corner. Worse yet, the floor was soaked, and an overpowering stench of sewage filled the air, so foul that it made my stomach churn. I had to fight back the urge to gag. It felt like stepping into a nightmare, a chaotic scene that sent a shiver down my spine. The plumbers got to work right away, and my wife and I chose to stay upstairs, letting them handle the situation without interference. Aaron, however, remained in his room, muttering that he didn't trust them and insisting on keeping a close watch. An uncomfortable silence filled the house as we waited, a strange sense of unease creeping over us. After about an hour, the plumbers finally emerged from the basement. One of them, looking visibly shaken, stepped forward and held out a small piece of plastic in his hand. His face was pale, and I could tell something was very wrong. "All sorted now," the plumber muttered, but his tone lacked confidence. Something was off. Before I could even ask about the cost, he and his partner hurriedly gathered their tools and bolted out the door like they were escaping from something. Aaron still hadn't come up from the basement. The only sounds were the frantic scraping and shuffling of objects as if he was desperately moving things around. Then, out of nowhere, a blood-curdling scream tore through the house, shattering the tense silence. It was the first time I'd ever heard him sound like that. Something about the way Aaron screamed sent a chill down my spine. He had always been a quiet, reserved guy, but now, it was as if he had completely unraveled. My wife and I didn't dare go near the basement. Instead, we went upstairs to our room, desperate for a proper shower after the long, stressful day. 3 hours passed, and an unsettling silence filled the house. A growing sense of unease crept over us. "I'm getting worried about Aaron," my wife finally said. "Maybe we should check on him." As she opened the door, she froze in place. Aaron was standing in the hallway, his towering frame hunched forward. His face was obscured by tangled, greasy hair, and his lips moved in an eerie, inaudible whisper. "Aaron, stop messing around," she said with a nervous laugh, trying to shake off the unease. But before she could react, Aaron lunged at her, wrapping his hands around her neck. With terrifying strength, he hurled her down the stairs. I rushed toward her, but Aaron was already descending, gripping a large knife in his hand. "You two were like family to me. I really cared about you. But I don't think this can continue," he muttered, his voice eerily calm. Just then, the doorbell rang. Aaron turned to me, pressed a finger to his lips, and slowly opened the door. 3 police officers stood on the porch. "Well, looks like someone took a fall. Pretty funny, right?" Aaron chuckled darkly. "All right, you got me. There's a body over there, and if you're looking for the rest, they're in the freezer." The police immediately arrested Aaron. Later, we learned that the plumbers had called the authorities after discovering a human hand lodged in the drain. Aaron was sentenced to death and executed on December 8, 2019. His final words, "Tell my family I'll see them soon." And that was the last time I ever saw him. Last year, I decided to book an Airbnb in a quiet Canadian town close to my cousin's place to celebrate the holidays. Since he resides in a rather remote area, the only options were cabins. I picked one without much thought and arrived a few days ahead of Christmas. The start of my trip was fantastic. I reunited with family members I hadn't seen in ages, and we spent hours reminiscing. However, things soon got out of hand when nearly 30 of us squeezed into his 3-bedroom home. As you can imagine, it was absolute mayhem. Christmas Day was especially overwhelming. We watched the kids tear through their presents in the morning, enjoyed a big breakfast, and I stayed until dinner at 7 p.m. Feeling exhausted, I decided it was time to head back to the cabin, which was nestled deep in the forest just beyond the town. The place was warm and inviting, but as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading straight to the front door. They hadn't been there earlier. At first, I assumed they belonged to the host, maybe stopping by to check on things. But as I approached the door, I saw no signs of anyone actually entering. Brushing it off, I stepped inside and let it go. I tossed my jacket onto the sofa and sank into a chair, feeling drained. The thought crossed my mind to message the host and ask about the footprints, but I figured if it was something important, he would have reached out to me first. So I brushed it off. I'd barely been sitting for a few minutes before sleep overtook me. It couldn't have been more than 10 minutes when a sudden sound jolted me awake. The doorbell rang. I jolted awake, my mind still groggy from sleep, and instinctively got up to answer the door. Standing there was a man with straight dark hair, clad in a brown jacket. He gave a quick smile and introduced himself as the Airbnb host. Still half asleep, I barely processed his words and let him speak. He casually asked about my stay before mentioning that he needed to inspect a few things in the cabin before heading out. Without much thought, I simply nodded, barely registering his words. It wasn't until he stepped past me and entered the cabin that it hit me. I had just allowed a complete stranger inside, without hesitation. That realization snapped me fully awake. I watched as he wandered around, scanning the room in a way that felt aimless, as if he wasn't sure what he was even looking for. A chill ran down my spine. His behavior felt off. Why would he need to check anything on Christmas night? Couldn't it have waited until morning? I began to suggest that he come back the next day since I was expecting more family, but the moment I spoke, his expression darkened. He turned to face me, his features tightening as if my words had irritated him. Then, without a word, he strolled toward the door. For a brief second, I thought he was leaving, but instead he calmly shut the door and slid the key into the lock. A wave of panic surged through me, and in that instant, I knew I was in danger. Without hesitation, I bolted toward the bedroom and slammed the door shut behind me. Mere seconds later, I heard him struggling to force it open. My mind raced. I had no plan. My phone and car keys were still in my jacket on the sofa, leaving me with no choice but to think fast. My eyes darted around the room until I spotted an old window at the back of the house, the kind with a handle that flipped open like a hatch. Wasting no time, I rushed to unlatch it. Behind me, the door groaned under the force of his attempts to break in. With one final push, I squeezed through and sprinted toward the trees, my legs moving so fast it felt like I was floating. When I glanced back, I saw him burst out the front door. Shrouded in darkness, he stood frozen, scanning the area, clearly bewildered by my sudden disappearance. What felt like an endless 15 or 20 minutes crawled by before he finally climbed into his car and drove away. My chest tightened at the thought of what could have happened if I hadn't made it out through that window. Still shaken, I stayed hidden a little longer, needing to be absolutely sure he was gone. Once I was certain it was safe, I sprinted back to the cabin and immediately dialed 911. While I was on the call, the actual owner of the property and the real Airbnb host arrived to verify that the man had been an imposter. The whole situation struck them as incredibly bizarre. Their best guess was that he had somehow learned the cabin was an Airbnb and took advantage of that to gain access. But the most unsettling part was that no one ever figured out what he had truly intended to do. That night was deeply unnerving and left me with an overwhelming sense of unease. It taught me a harsh lesson: never be too quick to trust someone you don't know. Since then, I've remained cautious, always staying vigilant in unfamiliar situations. It's unsettling to think how even a peaceful getaway can spiral into something straight out of a nightmare. No child should ever have to go through the kind of fear that unfolded on that September evening. It was the night before Halloween, September 30th, and I had agreed to watch over Benjamin, my best friend's son. I thought it would be nice for him to stay at my place for the night. Benjamin, Benji, as I warmly call him, was a boy I had known since birth. I was even there at the hospital the day he came into the world. His mother, Cleo, had entrusted him to me once before, but that visit was cut short when he suddenly fell ill. This time, however, Benji was full of life, excited to spend time together. My home, a cozy 3-bedroom house in a quiet Missouri town, sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, which always made me feel safe. Behind it stretched a dense forest, and on peaceful nights I found comfort in the silence it provided. That evening, the scent of freshly made spaghetti still lingered in the air, and I couldn't help but smile as I watched him devour his meal. I felt a sense of pride that he enjoyed my cooking so much. I even texted Cleo to boast about it. Around 9 p.m, Benji was already in his pajamas, curled up on the couch. Exhausted from the long week, I settled beside him and casually asked if he thought it was time for bed. He grinned mischievously and quipped, "Maybe for you," which made me chuckle. I had a soft spot for Benji. He was like a nephew to me, and I often found myself giving in to his little requests. That night was no different. I allowed him to stay up a bit longer but firmly set a bedtime of 10:30. He agreed without protest and kept watching his show. Not long after, I retreated to my room and collapsed into bed, slipping into sleep almost instantly. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by a terrifying nightmare, my heart still pounding from the fear it left behind. Before I could fully process it, I felt someone shaking my bed. My eyes flew open, and there, standing in front of me, was Benji. A startled cry escaped my lips. "What's the matter, Benji?" I asked, my voice groggy with sleep. "I'm hungry," he murmured. But there was something odd about the way he said it, like he was nervous. "You already had 2 big bowls of spaghetti, sweetheart," I reminded him. He hesitated for a moment, his wide eyes filled with fear. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, "I want more." I sighed, irritation creeping in. Being woken up in the middle of the night was never my favorite thing. "Benji, you promised to go to bed. You can eat in the morning," I muttered, pulling the blanket over my head and shutting my eyes again. But barely 10 seconds passed before he started shaking the bed again, his voice barely above a whisper as he insisted that he needed more spaghetti. His urgency was unsettling. I turned to look at him, confused. This wasn't like Benji at all. He'd never acted this way before. But, as always, I found myself giving in. All right, I sighed, dragging myself out of bed and trailing behind him through the dimly lit house toward the kitchen. But just before we reached the fridge, he suddenly grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly tight. I glanced down at him and felt my stomach drop. His eyes were filled with tears, and his small body trembled. "What's wrong, Benji?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His lower lip trembled as he clung to my wrist. "There's a man in your room," he murmured. "He's under the bed." A cold chill ran down my spine, but I forced a skeptical smile. "Benji, there's no one under my bed," I said, trying to reassure him, though a small knot of unease had already formed in my chest. Before I could say anything else, a sharp crunching sound echoed from the hallway. We both froze. My breath hitched as my eyes darted to Benji. His face was streaked with silent tears. That was enough to snap me out of my daze. Without another thought, I scooped him into my arms and sprinted toward the back door. I yanked it open and bolted into the night, the backyard swallowed in darkness. It was only then that I realized I had left my phone sitting on my dresser. But there was no way I was going back. My only option was to get to my nearest neighbor's house and pray they were awake. With Benji gripping my hand tightly, I dashed through the woods toward my neighbor's yard. The branches scratched against my arms, but I barely noticed. Halfway there, my foot slammed into something hard. A tree root or a rock, I couldn't tell. A sharp pain shot through my little toe, but I gritted my teeth and kept running. Just as I neared the neighbor's backyard, instinct made me glance back at my house. My stomach dropped. The garage door was open, and in the dim light, I swore I saw a shadow shift inside. My pulse pounded in my ears. Every step felt like an eternity. The ground crunching beneath my feet far too loud against the suffocating silence. A terrible thought clawed its way into my mind. Was he following us? Somehow, I made it to the neighbor's front porch, breathless and shaking. With trembling hands, I pounded on the door before finally managing to call the police. Minutes later, flashing lights and wailing sirens shattered the eerie silence, bringing a brief sense of relief. The officers moved swiftly, searching every inch of my house, but the intruder was nowhere to be found. The only clue left behind was my bedroom window, wide open, suggesting that whoever had been lurking under my bed had escaped into the dense forest beyond. To this day, I have no idea who was hiding there, how they got in, or how long they had been watching me. But the most terrifying part? I'll never know what they intended to do. For a long time, I was convinced that Damon, my unstable ex-boyfriend, was behind it. But my suspicions wavered after I confronted him at a cafe where I was meeting a friend. He seemed genuinely confused, swearing he had no idea what I was talking about. His reaction felt too real to ignore. Even now, that night haunts me. I jolt awake, drenched in sweat, as horrifying visions of Benji and me being attacked by a faceless intruder flood my mind. Sleep never comes easy anymore. Worse still, my bond with Benji's mom has faded. We no longer share the same closeness, just the occasional message to check in. She assures me that Benji still cares about me, but I know the truth. He's too afraid to ever stay with me again. And honestly, I can't blame him.